Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think we'll get going. Welcome to the Ben Alman Research and Science Rounds in the Department of Surgery at the University of Toronto. My name is Jim Rutka, Chair of the Department of Surgery. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Nadine Caron to the University of Toronto Rounds. She is professor at the UBC Northern Medical Program and will be introduced more formally in a moment by Dr. Michael Failings. But it also gives me great pleasure to welcome Ben Alman on board. So Ben, really nice to see you. Ben is joining us from Duke University, where he is the professor and chair of orthopedic surgery. Those of you who have been at the University of Toronto long enough will remember Ben in his roles as the vice chair of research in the Department of Surgery, but also as an orthopedic surgeon at Sick Kids Hospital and as the university division chair of orthopedics, among many other positions that he held while he was here. And up until recently, Ben had his laboratory still at the University of Toronto. So Ben, welcome. Great to have you here today. Did you want to say a word, Ben?
Yeah, no, great. Listen, thanks a lot. I really appreciate this lectureship continuing. It's great. And thanks, Nadine, for coming to give this talk, especially getting up this early on the West Coast. And I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I actually was planning on being there in Toronto this week, but with everything going on at the present time, sort of those plans got nixed. But it's really good to see everyone, at least virtually.
Great, thanks very much, Ben. Just want to begin with a land acknowledgement. So we wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates for thousands of years. It has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Our treaty obligations and commitment include learning about the history of these lands and territory and the structured dispossession that Indigenous nations have been subject to by Canada, and learning about justice, equity, structures of power, and to imagine how to build social relations for a different world. We affirm our solidarity with the Indigenous peoples of this land, working towards their self-determination and sovereignty from settler colonialism. So with that, I'll turn the program over to Michael. Again, welcome everybody to the Ben Alman Rounds. And Michael, over to you.
Thank you, Jim. And welcome everyone to our first academic lectureship of the 2022 year, and what an opening to the year it has been as we navigate the latest wave in the COVID pandemic. And I know that this is occupying everyone's minds and dominating our professional lives, but nonetheless, it's important for us to carry on with our work. And from that theme, as the vice chair in the Department of Surgery responsible for research, I have the privilege of trying to decide kind of an important theme that might reflect our discussions in the area of research and investigation. And one of the important themes that has emerged are topics around equity, diversity, and inclusion. And along that line, it's my privilege as the vice chair to welcome Dr. Nadine Caron as our 2022 Ben Alman lecturer. So as Dr. Rutka has indicated, Dr. Caron is a professor and active staff in the Department of Surgery at the University of Northern British Columbia. And I'll just give a few kind of points of background. Dr. Caron, who I actually learned about through discussions with colleagues at the University of Toronto as we were thinking about an appropriate speaker to reflect the themes of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And Dr. Caron has had a very a prominent role nationally around a number of topics related to pharmacare and a whole host of issues. So Nadine is a member of the Sagamok First Nation, and she's a surgical oncologist in northern BC, where she provides a practical diagnostic and surgical care for individuals in these rural communities. And many of these people are Indigenous. She's the sole Indigenous physician within BC Cancer, which is the only Indigenous academic faculty member in University of BC's Faculty of Medicine. And she's a professor there, and she's a senior scientist in the Michael Smith Genome Sciences Center at BC Cancer. She also holds the inaugural First Nations Health Authority Chair in Cancer and Wellness at UBC, and she's been quite active, not only from a practice perspective, but in terms of a number of initiatives. So as an example, she's the co-director of the UBC Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health, and has shown significant leadership in a program entitled Improving Indigenous Cancer Journeys, a Roadmap. She's also had a significant leadership role in the development of the Northern Biobank initiative, which includes a First Nations governed and controlled biobank that will kind of enhance research into the cancers experienced by First Nations people in northern BC. And along that theme, she's also a co-lead investigator on a project called the Silent Genomes Initiative, which is essentially investigating the genetic basis for a number of disorders experienced by Indigenous children. So that just gives a brief snapshot of the credentials and background of Dr. Caron. And Nadine, we're very honored to have you give our lecture. All of us are very disappointed that you're not here in person, but this is the reality. And we also appreciate your gracious willingness to give this lecture at a very early hour on the West Coast. So we look forward to your lecture.
All righty. Thank you, Chimigwich. Dr. Alman, Dr. Fellings, Dr. Rekka, thank you so much for the honor of joining you early hour, but still very, very pleased and wish I could be there in person. I am joining you this morning from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Lheidli peoples, which goes by another name that is one of the more colonial names in Canada. The city I live in and work from is Prince George, British Columbia. It's up in the Northern Health Authority. British Columbia has 5 geographic health authorities, the largest of which by far from the geographic point of view is the Northern Health Authority, which makes up about the northern 2/3 of the province. And that'll be important as we talk a little bit about some of the stories I'd like to share with you this morning. Is the profession changing us, or are we changing the profession? I think this is a critical, fundamental question. While I speak from my perspective today as an Anishinaabe person, I am not here today in any way as a representative of Ojibwe people, First Nations healthcare providers, or my First Nations community. And while I share stories from my perspective as an academic surgeon trying to balance clinical practice with research and teaching, among other roles, I don't in any way represent surgeons or researchers or educators. We have more in common than we have differences, though. Important similarities that we need to acknowledge is that we have all been tasked, either with the opportunity or the responsibility, to care for this beautiful territory that we refer to as Turtle Island. And we have all been gifted the opportunity to be part of this profession. What we do with these opportunities is up to us. The beautiful, the lovely declaration of conflicts of interest. I think we all have a love-hate relationship with this slide. I don't have any financial conflicts to declare, but I do think it's important for anyone in an audience to realize who's talking to them so that they can interpret what's being said more accurately and with a perspective. So I don't feel like I can separate who I am, experiences I've had, where I'm from how or what I think. And I think it's important. Professional roles and personal perspectives for me are so intertwined, and together they will be the backbone of the perspectives that I share. Potential, perceived, or real conflicts on what are going to be important when you reflect back on what I say today. Let me give you an example. I'm an Anishinaabe woman. I'm a member of the Sagamok Anishinaabe First Nation. I'm a First Nations daughter and mother, granddaughter, great-granddaughter, an Ojibwe sister, auntie, niece, cousin, a Native friend, colleague, community member, an Aboriginal physician, educator, learner, researcher, advocate, an Indigenous mentor, mentee, role model, an Indian consultant and board member of research agencies. Oh yeah, right. And also a surgeon who happens to be Indigenous. So actually going back to the conflict of interest slide a bit, I wanted to explain it because I think a conflict of interest can be defined as any situation in which an individual is in a position to exploit a professional or official capacity in some way for personal benefit. I believe in this profession, which includes not just our scalpels or our sutures or robotic tools in the operating room, and all our tools and our experiences as researchers and educators. I think we aim to have a positive impact on the world around us. What I do in my professional role hopefully will address the disparities we see when comparing Indigenous peoples in Canada with the rest of our country, whether it's health status, access and utilization to healthcare services, social determinants of health, or even opportunities to participate in health research that helps to address these disparities. Professionally, I've aimed to be part of the solutions that we find, create, implement, and optimize the health and wellness of Indigenous peoples in Canada. So if my role, my job, my ambition is to improve the health and wellness of Indigenous peoples in Canada, take a look at this list. If I'm successful in any way, shape, or form, how can I not benefit personally from that improvement in health status and that improvement in health and wellness of Indigenous peoples? I think it's hard. I have too many conflicts of interest, really, whether it's personal or professional roles. And I would argue that some may feel that it's a place of empowerment, because I think overall, when you're faced with barriers, you're less likely to quit, to lay down, or to rest. Admittedly, it may be more frustrating and bring more outrage, more emotions. There's a proverb that I used to have on a little poster that was in various places on different walls as I went through training of medical school residency, but I still have it at my home today. And it simply says, I walk, I run, I fall down, and meanwhile, I keep dancing. And right now, I think conflicts of interest, like we heard in the introduction, I think we're in a time and place in our country right now where organizations, universities, agencies, companies, they welcome conflicts like this on their competency matrix in their organizations. Preparation for this lecture caused me to think a great deal about the questions that formed its title, about changing the profession or the profession changing us, and the associated stories where that question emerged from. The title of this talk really leads from a story and experience that I had playing basketball at Simon Fraser University, but I'll share that story. If I shared that story, I would basically get derailed and start talking about university basketball. And then Dr. Alman and I would start talking about Duke, and then it would just get messy. So we're going to stay focused, leapfrogging a little bit in this story that has me as an undergraduate pre-medical student shadowing a surgeon in Jackson, Tennessee, by the name of Dr. Tom Edwards. Back in the days when you could say you were interested in a career in medicine, the surgeon could say he or she was okay with you shadowing them for the summer. And then you would find yourself immersed in this situation where you could follow the surgeon around and actually see the profession kind of from the inside. You could go to the emergency room, to the hospital, to the clinic, to the operating room. And yes, I even spent time with Dr. Edwards and his family at his home. I saw the profession from the inside out early on, before I even got into medical school. They were long days, late nights in the emergency room, weekends in the operating room, and I asked a lot of questions, incessantly. He asked them right back to me when, with my background in kinesiology, I was fascinated by everything I was learning about the human body and the field of medicine. All questions were fair game. And then we were doing rounds one Sunday morning. We were with a patient let's call him Bill. Now, Bill was ventilated in the ICU. Overnight, he had taken a turn for the worse, and Dr. Edwards was explaining this to his wife, Sally, of 40 years. This outcome was not expected. The weekend had started with hope for a different outcome. The potential surgery was now not an appropriate clinical option. The medical treatment that we had tried had failed. Dr. Edwards was now recommending a new clinical target, keeping this gentleman, husband and father, friend and brother, neighbor and colleague, comfortable. Sally broke down into tears, the news that she feared most. She nodded, unable to speak, and after a few moments, Dr. Edwards uttered a few kind words of condolences and quietly left the room. I stayed a bit longer. My feet seemed fixed to the floor, not knowing what to say. How do you walk away? How do you stay? I felt like I was hiding in the corner of her nightmare. I felt a tear escape the corner of my eye. I whispered something about how sorry I was, and then I left the room holding my breath. Studying for the MCAT was in no way preparing me for moments like this. Dr. Edwards was back at the nurse's station writing in Bill's chart. I could feel myself shaking from the emotion that I had just felt. Dr. Edwards, he seemed unfazed. He wrote a progress note, he wrote some orders, and then he was talking to the nursing team about the clinical diagnosis and the change in plans. And then he looked over at me and smiled, and he said, we just have surgical north to do, and then we're done our rounds and we can go grab a coffee. And then off he went, and me scrambling after him. The ups and downs of this profession were staggering, and he was teaching me the ropes. Later that night, sitting at his patio, watching the lightning bugs, I asked him a question that I didn't think I would find in an answer in a textbook at my desk. Dr. Edwards, do you ever cry? He looked over to me. I went on to clarify this question because he seemed surprised. I mean, around the suffering, the death, the loss of loved ones, giving bad news, the complications, all those around you, the patients and their families, they cry. Do you ever cry? I could see his expression now. He looked sort of serious, but mostly amused. Oh, Nadine, he started, pausing momentarily. You'll get used to it. The ER, the ICU, the OR, the code blues. You have to take the ups and the downs. You'll be able to handle it all. You'll get there. He went back to my original question. No, I don't cry. He smiled. Maybe there was a time when he wondered this too. We both turned back to watching the lightning bugs. I remember thinking, there was so much to learn. Anatomy, physiology, pathophysiology, surgical techniques, histories, physicals, diagnostic tests, procedures. I would put my head down and I would learn it all and add this to my list. How to be professional, how to distinguish myself as a physician. I felt so fortunate that this was my career path. And physicians, especially surgeons, they seem stoic, controlled, focused on the most vital tasks. They seem like masters of their domain. I was inspired. Dr. Edwards was my first mentor in the medical profession. Now, objectives. Okay, Dr. Felling knows this. I had to give these objectives a month or two ago. And I remember thinking, what am I going to talk about? What should I? And I put these objectives out there and I thought they're the verbs that you're supposed to use with objectives: to raise awareness, to explore, to encourage. And I thought I'm going to switch them into questions. Is it changing us? Are we changing it? Is it a responsibility? Is it an opportunity? And what should we change? But then to put it more succinctly, I'm hoping really this morning to stimulate thoughts and dialogue that can continue well into 2022 as we work together as colleagues in this amazing profession. But that kind of objective to stimulate thought, I thought, in our Western ways, they may challenge the CME credits. This morning was not meant about giving you answers. My true aim, honestly, or my true objective, is to share my perspectives, some stories, share some questions, with the hopes that there's something about this next hour that you will talk about, think about, ponder, question after today. Now, talking about questions, I think questions are powerful tools. I think the ability to ask questions is a fundamental skill in medicine. And I must say, for the past 22 months, we've all been full of questions for the entire pandemic. Getting ready for this talk, I contemplated about questions and the power of them, what you ask, how you ask, who you ask, when, where, why, all impact the story that will emerge from the questions that you ask. And we see this clinically all the time. I mean, the differences in the stories that you get from an ER consult. First, you get the brief story from the triage nurse. And then if we're consulted as the surgery team, we get the amalgamated story of what the medical student or the resident and the emerge doc all got from the patient and their family. And then they consult the surgery team, and then we ask the medical student to go down, or the resident, and they run it by maybe the senior resident or the fellow, and then we go down as the faculty and we talk to the patient. And all of a sudden, really, it's an amalgamation of all of these stories, all of these questions, that is probably the most accurate in terms of what the patient was trying to say to begin with. Questions, we see this professionally. Questions we ask in interviews, how we answer questions when we're being interviewed, or when we stand up using our titles, whether it's dean, department, division head, chair of a research chair. And we also, the questions we expect those to work on our behalf when they are our dean or our department head or our division head or a chair. We see questions and how they impact how we teach, and how questions impact how we learn. We often provide feedback as reviewers for grants or manuscripts or supervisors of graduate students, and we provide that feedback in the form of a question. Questions, of course, given these research rounds, are the absolute foundation of research projects that we pursue. Our ability, our willingness to ask questions may be linked more than we know or more than we acknowledge on how we become and succeed in various measures. As physicians, researchers, educators, mentors, learners, indeed, how we are viewed by members of society is tied to the power of the questions that we have the courage to ask. So if questions matter so much, do you mind if I ask a few? I mean, if we were in person, I would ask you to just put up your hand, or if I would ask you to yell out the answers or put up your hands if it was yes or no, but we can't do that today. So do you mind if I ask a few? Dr. Fellings, do you mind?
Oh, sure, please. Go ahead.
Okay. All right, we'll get started. Oh, breathe. Thank you for sharing that silence, for taking a few moments to consider those questions in honor of stories told and in honor of those we will never hear. As surgeons, educators, researchers, trainees, we have selected a profession where we are surrounded by questions. Those our students, patients, our colleagues ask us, and those we ask our colleagues, patients, and students. Indeed, the power of questions really is, they can lead us to stories. And stories are powerful ways to teach. I mean, in surgery, sometimes we call stories cases so that we can sound more clinical, like cases at M&M rounds, or we call them cases so we can sound more academic, like case-based learning. Stories can be termed qualitative data. In the research space, where we use thematic analysis and software tools like in vivo to change stories and vignettes into data and themes. We actually need stories to accompany research results. Try sending out a media release about an upcoming research publication without a story about a research participant or patient or community that's ultimately going to benefit from the research results that you're publishing and want to share with the rest of the country. Stories provide context, rationale, reason. And the truth about stories, here's a quote from one of my favorite Indigenous authors, Thomas King. The truth about stories is that that's all we are. And reflecting on my career to date in this profession, the stories are what tie my career together. And in honor of the Ben Alman Research and Science Lecture, I want to share 3 stories in my journey developing my research career that have come to mind when I was preparing for this talk. So let's start at the beginning. The very first research project that I was involved in was in medical school. Given the glimpse that Dr. Edwards had given me, I knew I wanted to be a surgeon, and now all of a sudden, hepatobiliary and transplantation I found intriguing. After a discussion with BC Transplant team, I began to work on this pretty elementary retrospective chart review. My research question was, a decade into the program's existence, what were the indications for liver transplant for BC's First Nations recipients? It says Aboriginal here. It's a dated term because it was in 2000 that this was published. But when looking at the self-identified indigeneity, all of the participants that were included in this study ended up being First Nations. After hours in the basement of the hospital medical records department, the chart review was completed and we began our data analysis. While small, Toronto standards, minuscule in scope regarding numbers and complexity, it had a major impact, primarily on me. I remember the day we looked at the data. I was looking at it with one of the faculty members. This was the first formal review of liver transplantation within an Indigenous population in North America. And after we had a couple of minutes to absorb it, we were both surprised, and I did not hide my emotional response to it. Indications for liver transplant in BC were really the same as the rest of Canada. The top 3 indications in order were hepatitis C, 30%, 18% had PBC or primary biliary cholangitis, and 12 had alcoholic liver disease. Those were for BC overall. When looking specifically at the First Nations population that were recipients in that time period, for the most common indications in order for BC First Nations was PBC over 50%, autoimmune hepatitis 27%, and acute liver failure at 13%. So let's look at it a little bit differently. So hepatitis C and alcoholic liver disease, sometimes, often associated with social stigma, made up 42% of the indications for liver transplant for most programs in Canada and North America at the time. And when it came to First Nations specific, 80% were for autoimmune liver disease. So we were looking at the same data, but we had very different perspectives. So my faculty member that I was looking at it with was a hepatologist. Oh my goodness, the autoimmune liver disease, look at that. 80% of First Nations were getting transplants for autoimmune liver disease. The prevalence we knew was higher, but what about the incidence, the progression to end-stage liver disease? Was it purely genetic? Was it multifactorial? This was exciting and he wanted to find the answers, and this was fascinating. I, as a First Nations medical student, saw it very differently. Only one First Nations patient had received a liver transplant for hepatitis C, which is and was back then the most common indication for liver transplant and the need for it for this life-saving procedure. No transplant for alcoholic liver disease had ever been performed in British Columbia for any First Nations patient since the beginning of the program. Referral or selection bias? What type of multifactorial explanation would explain the First Nations data? Bias, negative stereotypes, assumptions? I think I was too early on in my career to say the blatant R word, but I was certainly concerned about it. See, when we look at the big three and we look at the absence of hepatitis C or relative absence in alcoholic liver disease, we knew that there were elevated risks and prevalence of these diagnoses in First Nations in BC and elsewhere in Canada. But that risk, those rates, and the subsequent end-stage liver disease and death that sometimes arose from that were not mirrored in the referral rates to this life-saving opportunity. They were not mirrored in the transplantation rates. And I wondered, this whole thing about universal healthcare and how we're so proud of it as Canadians to have this universal healthcare system, did we really have it? Was there equitable distribution of life-saving resources? This elusive chase for equity, I started to actually see. I was looking with a First Nations lens at the impact of liver disease. And then it was that lens, this First Nations lens, this Indigenous lens, that I was used for the years to come on this journey towards equity. But there was an increased risk of autoimmune liver disease, and that was important to note. There was an increased risk overall of autoimmune diseases in First Nations in terms of entities that I had already been learning about, things like arthritis that I had witnessed in my internal medicine rotations. And the rates of PBC in First Nations and American Indians has subsequently been noted in the Pacific West Coast to be thought to be the highest anywhere in the world, both the Alaska Panhandle in the US and subsequently down the BC coast. Why is that? It was a good question, certainly, to ask. And so a critical part of this story is that it wasn't just my emotional journey to see the data spelled out, to spell out the inequities, but to see the power that the research and the data could have. Even a retrospective chart review done by a medical student. After this, some of the faculty members from this paper went on to work with primary care providers and specialists to educate on the risks of liver disease in First Nation populations in BC and the role of liver transplant services for individuals with end-stage liver disease. Some faculty went on and shared the results with the BC Transplant program and made efforts to clarify and educate when to refer patients to BC Transplant, and that decisions regarding eligibility for transplantation should be made by the BC Transplant Service, with the hopes that potential barriers upstream at the referral level would be eliminated. I felt like my perspectives and my concerns were heard. Also, the results from this small study sparked a long-term research commitment to explore this from the medical genetics and hepatology perspectives with some of the First Nations communities that were particularly hard hit by this clinical entity. And while my research journey started with mentors from the surgical transplant team, Dr. Charles Scudamore, Stephen Chung, this experience introduced me to a longtime mentor and medical geneticist, Dr. Laura Arbour, who subsequently I have worked with for the following decades. See, 17 years later, Dr. Arbour, who had started a study at the time working with these Indigenous communities, had a follow-up medical genetics research manuscript that began while we were working on that paper. This paper that was published in 2017 was accepted for publication on December 21st, 2017. Now, why does Dr. Arbour and myself remember that day so clearly? It was on that day that we were informed that we had been successful, Dr. Arbour, myself, and Wyeth Wasserman, along with a massive, amazing research team on our Genome Canada LSARP grant, which aims to, among others, deliverables, develop governance structures for Indigenous genomics data, focusing on the creation and implementation of an Indigenous background variant library to tackle the long-standing problem that data from individuals who identify as Indigenous are starkly absent from genomic databases that are used for clinical tools for diagnosis in Canada, along Turtle Island, and globally. This project, entitled Silent Genomes, provides an opportunity for equity for Indigenous peoples to be part of the creation of this clinical tool and the emerging guidelines and governance in this evolving field of Indigenous data sovereignty. But that'll be a story for another day. My first research project in medicine gave me a glimpse of the impact that research could have in the healthcare system, in clinical care, in health policy, in advocating for populations with hard data that supported their concerns, I guess in a way, supporting the hypothesis. But as I understood and endorsed the role research would take more and more, there was an increasing realization that this resource, called research, carried with it its own inequities. So fast forward a few years in my research career, and after medical school, surgical residency, master's degree, fellowship, while I embarked on the path as assistant professor in surgery at UBC's Northern Medical Program. It's based on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Lheidli-T'enneh, where I still live now, up in Prince George, British Columbia, in the Northern Medical Program. I was suddenly an Indigenous surgeon struggling in my career as an academic in Northern BC, realizing that where I had trained in Vancouver and other Southern metropolitan academic centers was very, very different than where I had established my clinical and research career. I was now a subspecialist in a community hospital. I was the only academic physician. I was the only Indigenous physician. I started my career up in Prince George 2 days before the medical students even arrived. There were no surgical residents, and to this date, there still are no research fellows or clinical fellows. A perspective of meeting patients from populations, rural, remote, and Indigenous communities that were marginalized from research opportunities really hit home about 3 years into my clinical practice. And I'll tell you this story. It was a phone call that started it all. And I vividly remember that phone call. She wanted to see me. This is a patient of mine that I hadn't seen for about 3 years. And she called because she wanted to see me, but it wasn't a referral from her family physician or from a specialist or from the emergency room. She just needed to talk to me. Let's give her a name. Dr. Alman, can you give me a name of this lady?
Any name?
Any name.
Let's use Val.
Val, okay. So Val had called and she wanted to talk to me. So I told my medical office assistant didn't know anything further, but she had pulled out Val's chart and I'd read it and said, okay, I'll talk to her at the end of the day. And I remember clearly it was a Wednesday. So Val came in at the end of the day and she was upset. She wasn't angry at me, but she was definitely upset. And so basically it was approximately 3 years into my clinical practice. Her question was linked directly to her story. See, she had had cancer 2 years ago. I saw her in follow-up after her surgery, and she went on to see the oncologist in town and was told that she didn't need chemotherapy, news that she celebrated over and over again. And Val was telling me that day how much she celebrated it over and over again since I saw her. I mean, she said, every time I walk by a hair salon, I think in the back of my head, I'm so glad I didn't lose my hair. She told me that she had 2 daughters, and anytime they were sick, and she was holding back their hair when they were throwing up in the toilet, she was so grateful that she didn't go through those side effects that she knew that chemotherapy patients had. And then she said she can't help but think about it. Anytime she hears about treatments on the radio, reads about something in the newspaper, or sees a movie of someone going through that, she's grateful over and over again until that Monday. See, the week prior, she had seen her family doctor because she was having headaches, and her family doctor didn't think much of it, but it was her history of cancer that he didn't want to miss anything, so he had arranged for a CT head. And the day before she had come in to see me, she had received the results of metastatic disease. She reminded me that she had a colleague that had been diagnosed just before she had, who had the same type of cancer, the same grade, the same stage, just weeks before her. Now, Val was from a First Nations just outside of town, and her colleague that worked in the same company was based in Vancouver, but had all of the same sort of pathology. And she brought the story up, and as soon as she brought it up, I remembered it because it was really quite odd how similar these 2 colleagues, hundreds and hundreds of kilometers apart, were going through something very similar. I also remembered that her friend down in Vancouver had been diagnosed about 3 weeks earlier. And so it was very helpful for Val in terms of making some of the clinical decisions that she was making. So Val didn't have chemotherapy. Basically, her colleague did. Now, her colleague was placed in a randomized clinical trial. And Val's question that day to me, why didn't she get that option? She asked quite specifically, why didn't I get a choice? And then Val went on to say, okay, she knew that if she got the choice, maybe she would have decided not to go in the clinical trial. She said, I know it was a treatment that wasn't proven, or we didn't know if it was necessary or if it was going to help. That's why they were doing the research. She was aware of the risks and the factors of participating in the study. She understood the concept of randomization. She may not have even been randomized to the treatment arm and wouldn't have gotten chemotherapy anyways if she had said yes and she had gotten the choice. But still, she felt like she had lost something huge. Val felt like she lost a chance to make her diagnosis help those in the future, including her 2 children. She said to me that afternoon, children should be able to depend on their parents to make the world a safer place. She felt she could have contributed something good from something so far from that adjective, and she was never given the chance. The only thing different from the 2 pathology reports with the same diagnosis, the same stage, from 2 women who are the same age and both otherwise healthy, Val pointed out on the pathology report, were their postal codes. She became quiet and said, not being part of research eliminated her ability to have an impact on the future with her diagnosis. It prevented her from being a small part of a solution. It kept her from being part of something that was meant to drag down this thing they called cancer. And instead, she felt exposed for cancer to drag her. She was not part of any knowledge or understanding research could create, something that may even benefit one of her children one day. She pointed out very, very clearly that day that she could have been part of a solution to help her kids or her grandkids or her great-grandkids, but now all she had to give her 2 daughters was a first-degree relative with breast cancer. Like most in the Northern Health Authority, Val was an orphan when it came to research. I left my office that day and basically went to go talk to our oncologist who worked down the hallway from me. See, he had been in Northern Health working for 30 years, and I ran the story by him, wondering if there was something that Val had missed. But in his estimate, he knew of about 6 adult oncology patients in Northern Health who had participated in clinical trials over the past 3 decades. I was shocked to hear this number, and with a sigh of resignation from my senior colleague, who was well aware of the status quo. Remember, Northern Health is about the size of Germany. It's a huge geographic area. Why? I asked him. It takes time, he said. It takes human resources. They need a study nurse, not a community nurse. It takes money. They can't use our labs or our techs or our imaging. They need to pay, the patients need to travel to Vancouver if they want to participate. And because it's not clinically necessary, it's usually not covered. Up here, we're not considered part of academia. We're not part of the academic world. So we often don't even hear about the studies that are being put on elsewhere in BC or Canada. And he went on to list more and more barriers. Essentially, Val inspired questions that had answers I found, quite frankly, impossible to justify. Why are there such significant disparities in access to health research? Why are there disparities in opportunity and choice to participate in health research? Why are there disparities in allocating millions, hundreds of millions of dollars annually of research funding invested to impact change and to improve health, to optimize wellness? You know, I do believe that access to research is by itself a determinant of health. And that's the thing about talking to this group here at the Ben Alman lecture. Surely those in this virtual space, the impact of research is well understood. I mean, we aim for our research, any research, to make a difference. And the University of Toronto is internationally renowned for the impact of the research that you do. But with these disparities in access to research, it is clear that those who have access to research will benefit more. Or you could put it the other way, those who stand to benefit the most will likely benefit the least, unless the access to research opportunities are added to the list of disparities that we need to address in Canada's healthcare systems. It is data statistics, published studies that could make its way onto a politician's agenda, a university's strategic plan, healthcare programs, and the fundings that goes with it. I've learned that it doesn't matter much if you can make politicians, administrators, or healthcare advocates tear up at your stories. It will engage them for a minute, but I think really it's a delicate balance. There's the power of statistics of a population and the stories of individuals we do it for. And this is what I've said over and over again. Give them data they cannot refute and give them stories they cannot forget. And that is the balance I think that will matter. So let's jump forward in time for my last story. That phone call from Val, one of my first cancer patients, was the first patient in the North to ask me this question about access to research. Since then, I've been asking it for her. Clinically, academic responsibility, granting agencies, organizations, pointing out the reality of research gaps for those at the center of Canada's Venn diagram and highlighting each of these entities' responsibilities to address them. The Canadian Venn diagram, we have the Canadian population, but there's also those that are caught in the middle, northern, rural, remote, Indigenous, up in Prince George, up in the Northern Health Authority. When I see a patient, either in the clinic or in the hospital, they fit one of these adjectives, if not all four. And so, speaking of mentors and research, Dr. Mark Amara was the faculty member who reached out to me to invite me into the world of cancer research within the BC Cancer and Michael Smith Genome Sciences Center. We often talked about the field of oncogenomics and impacting to a greater and greater degree the knowledge, understanding, and the ultimate clinical implications in risk stratification, screening guidelines, diagnostic potential, and treatment in the field of oncology, and really across the profession of medicine as a whole, the rapidly evolving space of what we call precision medicine. And so Dr. Mara showed me a path that would enable me to link surgical oncology, Indigenous health, and the elusive chase for equity that I was on when he asked me to do the opening keynote address for the inaugural Terry Fox Research Institute Research Day in BC 10 years ago in December 2011. He gave me the opportunity to ask a question to an audience that was primarily basic science researchers. The audience was intimidating, to say the least. They were doing incredible research in this space a decade ago. But in this keynote address, I shared that I don't do genomic research, I could understand the value of the research that they did. I understood the role of bench to bedside research and how critical it was. I knew the value of Pillar 1 or genomic research, and no one in the room would question that. But I asked them to consider this question. What bedsides are getting to their bench? No one blinks an eye when we talk about bench to bedside, but what bedsides are at that bench? So I think the precision medicine was gaining momentum, and the concept of the genomic divide was becoming more and more evident. This was a field of research and clinical care for those who lived and sought healthcare in metropolitan centers in southern Canada along the US-Canada border. It's largely unavailable for rural, remote, northern, and Indigenous populations. It's largely unavailable to the patients that I had the honor of meeting on a daily basis in my clinic or at the hospital. And it was increasingly unavailable for those in that Canadian Venn diagram I showed you. So the World Health Organization, I think, said it very eloquently in this quote: the genomic health divide must be kept in check and ultimately bridged through equitable economic investment, clinical research, and provision and use of genomic services and technologies globally. So as a physician and researcher, I felt like I was invited to a party to celebrate the impact that this type of research in genomics was having. But in doing so, I was witnessing disparities that were growing with each new discovery, each successful research project, each step that was actively excluding Indigenous peoples or passively leaving us out. And the dialogue has been growing about why the field of genomics is so challenged in this area. See, I'm wondering if it's perhaps the most elusive pursuit for equity is in the spectrum of cancer research is in genomics. There's a paucity of Indigenous leadership in research foundations and funding agencies. Genomic data, like I said, from persons identifying as Indigenous are absent from variant reference databases used for diagnosis, the most common one being NOMAD. There's a paucity of Indigenous identifiers existing in biobanks globally. There's a paucity of Indigenous researchers and healthcare providers. There's an understanding of ethics via an Indigenous lens and the necessity to have these perspectives at the table for entities like Indigenous data sovereignty, but it seems to make researchers nervous. And publishers' knowledge of what is ethical and culturally respectful and safe to publish and how to gain that knowledge needs to be addressed much more fully in that space. I asked the question, it's interesting. The response to the question that I asked at that keynote address in terms of what bedsides are getting to the bench began a journey because the audience, they asked back. Presenters and audience members alike earnestly inquired in emails, phone calls, and conversations to me, how could they involve the North? And the concept of the Northern Biobank Initiative was launched. They asked me to create a research platform, a population-based biobank in a community hospital, so that Northern BC patients, communities, and families could have increased access to research and could be given the choice to participate. I was inspired to see that First Nations in Northern BC, a large percentage who are based in rural, remote settings, would be interested in creating a Northern First Nations biobank to be embedded within the Northern Biobank, but with First Nations governance, guidance, and ownership. So in 2012, the Northern Biobank, it could be used to participate as a research platform. Our research questions in the North could be included. The reliance on generalizability would no longer be implied as the only route to get information and new solutions. The capacity building in the community would be important as we had just opened the UBC distributed medical program 6 years earlier, and it was physically located at the University of Northern BC. Provincial and national research projects both could be inclusive. So for example, our colleagues down in Vancouver or colleagues in Toronto, if they wanted to include Northern Canada or Northern British Columbia, the platform would be ready for use. The NBI could partner with Southern Metropolitan Biobanks to facilitate participation and collaboration. There was a reason for the Northern Biobank. And the question then became, what about a First Nations biobank to be embedded within it? And so in 2012, we started to arrange a 2-day workshop in Prince George, including members from 14 different First Nations in the area, about what biobanking was, its current applications in research, and to discuss some examples of research that a biobank could enable or facilitate. The final session on the 2-day workshop was to break into small groups, brainstorm about the pros and cons of a First Nations biobank in Northern BC, what the risks were, what the potential benefits could be, and then the groups would come back together and share their thoughts on the whiteboard at the front of the room. And as we did that, the lists emerged, and they looked exactly how I would have expected them to, very similar to most biobanks based on my discussions and readings. There were additional elements involving cultural perspectives that I suspected would be raised based on the conversations that I'd had to date. No surprises. It seemed like all had been said. All the groups seemed happy that their input had been captured. But then there was this voice, an elder who had been fairly quiet for the entire 2 days, had something to say. And he stood up and he said, "You're missing my major concern." He continued, "Over the past few days, I've learned a lot about these so-called biobanks. But there's been this growing concern I've had, and no one has raised it at all over the past 2 days." I was at the front of the room with a pen in my hand. I was nervous because it felt like something that should have at least thought about. Was I disrespectful for not thinking about it, listing it, naming it? I didn't know what he was referring to. "Please," I said, "will you tell us your concern? This is so important for us to know." And he said, "My Ferrari will never break down on Highway 16. I wasn't sure what he meant. He said it again, "My Ferrari will never break down on Highway 16. So for those who have not been in Northern BC, Highway 16 starts at the Pacific Ocean and heads inwards east across Northern British Columbia. It could be a treacherous stretch of highway, whether it's live moose, deer, bear on the road, whether it's the treacherous conditions, whether it's at this time of year, the short days and the long nights, driving in the dark, whether it's the weather, the avalanches, the mudslides, whatever it is. The Highway 16 is treacherous at the best of times. You probably wouldn't see a Ferrari on there. at any point. And he was just telling me that the Ferrari wouldn't break down on Highway 16. I asked him to explain it a bit. And so he helped me out. He said, they think we are inconvenient. And they, being those of Western culture, protocols, ways of being, upon Indigenous communities, leaders, and organizations. I think he was referring to places like the University of Toronto, the University of British Columbia, the federal government, the provincial government, the healthcare system. He was referring to, they break promises. They don't know what true collaboration is. They think that it takes too much time. And they come to convenient assumptions. He went on to explain the assumptions. They think we're resistant to research, referring to his community and Indigenous people in general. They think they we don't trust academic institutions or researchers. They think we don't prioritize medical research. They think research with us takes too much time, effort, and money. And then he went on to share his greatest concern. My greatest concern is that we will never have the right or the opportunity to have the concerns that other Canadians have about medical research because it won't happen. Then he pointed to the list of concerns and the potential cons of having a biobank, a First Nations biobank. And he pointed to those lists and he said, my grandchildren, my children, my great-grandchildren, I'm worried they're never going to have those problems. And I'd never looked at it that way before. It's interesting, he went on to say, but you, Dr. Caron, you've asked, you've explained, you've shared before you even began. And because of that, I think the Northern Biobank Initiative saw the potential for the first time for a Northern BC First Nations biobank. Now, as we wrap up, remember Dr. Edwards and the question I asked on his porch while watching the lightning bugs? Well, the story about the question I asked Dr. Tom, do you ever cry? Little did I know that it would lead to the backbone of this opportunity to do the Ben Alman Research and Science Lecture. I left you at the end of the chapter, but the story didn't end there. I was a pre-med student studying for the MCATs. I went back 2 more summers to work with Dr. Edwards during my medical school years. But as my clinical clerkship in medical school came, I knew I wouldn't be able to come back for the following summers. It was time to apply for surgical residency. And we said that we would keep in touch, but he warned me, he didn't do letters. He didn't like to write letters, but he said call and we would stay in touch. I didn't use emails back then. There was no social media. There were no cell phones. I feel like I'm dating myself. The months, the years passed, and as clinical years in medical school and the first couple of years of general surgical residency consumed me. And then at the end of my second year of surgical residency, I received this battered looking envelope in the mailbox, at the residence mailbox at Vancouver General Hospital. It was years later. It was addressed to Dr. Nadine Crone, care of Vancouver General Hospital, Vancouver, BC, Canada. I opened it up. On the paper that was written on a prescription pad was a short, but technically a letter. And it read, Dear Nadine, I lied. I do cry. Don't let this profession change you. Change the profession. Tom. Remembered my altered objectives? I'm hoping that something about this talk will make you talk further, will make you think longer, will make you ponder, and will make you question. Every story I told you today had a teacher. It was a faculty member or a patient or a mentor. Every story I started with a question, from a research idea, from a patient, one you ask or why you try to answer. Dr. Edwards gave me a task that would define my career. I don't know if I'll get there, but I know what direction I'm going. My thoughts today are with the University of Toronto Department of Surgery family in these challenging times. I wish you change where it is needed, and I wish you a solid foundation upon which to reach for it. And I love this quote, what is possible should be done right away. What is impossible just takes a little longer. My gratitude to my mentors, Chi Miigwech.
Dr. Caron, thank you for a wonderful and inspiring lecture. I've received a number of comments in the Q&A about how much your lecture has meant to people. We're a little over time, but we're going to extend this until 9 to allow people, our time, to allow people to meet with you and to have some discussions. And Dr. Alman texted me that he would like to begin our discussion. So Ben, over to you.
Yeah, so sorry. So I'm actually, just because we're running late, I won't ask my question, but I will make a comment. So first, that was a fantastic talk. I really, really enjoyed it. And you know, it's impressive body of work that you've done. But it reminded me of one of my favorite quotes. And I know people, when I was in Toronto, used to hear this, but people haven't heard it for a while. So it's a quote from Isidore Rabi, who won the Nobel Prize. He actually was the person who did the fundamental work that was responsible for MRIs. And he won a Nobel Prize. And he gave this interview, was published in the New York Times, about why he became a Nobel laureate, because he came from an environment where all the other people in his neighborhood and he went to school with became like business people and lawyers, and he went into theoretical physics. And he said he did it because every day when all the other kids came home from school, their parents asked them, you know, what did you learn today? And his mom, he said, every day she came home and he asked her, did you ask a good question today? And I think that's a fundamental difference between staying in the profession and having just doing what we're always doing versus asking good questions that make a fundamental change. And I think you're a great, what you've talked about today is a fantastic example of asking good questions that made fundamental change, and really what research in the biomedical world is all about. So maybe we can talk offline. I can ask you other questions at some other point and talk about the democratizing of clinical research and how to get more people involved in it. And it's something that I think is a struggle we still have, but it's a fantastic lecture, and thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alman.
Thank you. So I'm just monitoring the Q&A as well. And there's a question from Dr. Rebecca Gladdy, and Dr. Gladdy wants to collaborate with you, bottom line. So Dr. Gladdy is a surgical oncologist and clinician scientist here at the U of T. So I don't know if you'd be open to sharing your email address with us, or so on. But Rebecca, maybe that might be a way for us to kind of make the to make the link. And then there's a question here. Thanks for sharing your link in the chat, so if everyone can see that. And then Dr. Caron, thank you for a brilliant, thought-provoking lecture. Essentially, what do you think is the role of students and trainees in terms of improving access to surgery, surgical research in rural and Indigenous communities?
Well, I think one of the things that when it comes to students and trainees, what I try to convey to the students that I have the honor of working with is that they're colleagues. And I think as soon as a trainee feels like your colleague, the productivity, the teamwork, the collaboration, and them being part of the solution, it just skyrockets and moves people, I think, sometimes years ahead in terms of progress in research, and their understanding that they can be a critical part of the team. And once they're treated like colleagues, and I see it all the time, you know, if I look at my mentors, just because I'm now became a physician or graduated from residency and then was I was an assistant professor. And so there's more of a difference between me being an assistant professor and my professor colleagues than there is between me being a first-year assistant professor and a surgery resident, which is separated by months. And I think if we can really do that, then you bring people in on your team that know that they can, that know that they can be part of it, and then you share your questions, you share your ideas, and most importantly, if you can get it across, you share your passion. And that's really giving them the opportunities not only to hear what you're thinking, but also to be in these communities, to meet these members, to be in these spaces, to be in the trenches. And I think that's why experiential learning is a big part of this. Once you connect with these communities, it's really, really hard to explain to them, you didn't get the grant, so you're not going to do the research project. You're basically saying it didn't get the grant, so you're going to be working to get the money because you said that you were going to commit to this. Research becomes much more of an engagement, a commitment, rather than something you do at a convenience if you get the grant or if you don't get the grant. And I think the more people that get that sort of experience, I think the more that people, our junior colleagues, will enter into research careers, even if they go into community medicine and become community surgeons. You don't have to be in the ivory tower to do it. It's interesting. I think my experience as being at the Northern Medical Program has proven that. I'm at a community hospital. I have the benefit of having one foot at UBC and another one where I'm working, you know, in small communities, either clinically or academically, and it's worked.
Just wanted to highlight just a couple of points that you just made, Nadine, and also Ben, and so which I think really resonate with me and with many of the faculty in our department. So one is that the University of Toronto Department of Surgery is very focused on the training of surgeons to at least have the opportunity to do research. And I think if that opportunity is not provided, people will never actually realize the potential impact of research. And you know, potentially many, if not most of our surgical trainees probably won't be active surgical researchers, but I hope that research will inspire people. But we have a very active program, the surgeon scientist training program in our department. So that's a big component of what we do. And this is a shout out to the surgeon scientist trainees who really serve to drive what we do. And then I fully agree with the comment that Ben Alman made. I think probably one of the most important skills is to ask the right question. So that's a really important point. So, question from Dr. Bev Orser. Dr. Caron, thank you for an outstanding lecture. Essentially, it's a practical question as well. Like, how do we actually practically establish relationships and links with rural, remote, and Indigenous communities? And I think one of the challenges that I think we experience in Toronto, and I mentioned this to you, is that Ontario, like BC, it's a huge province. And perhaps unlike some cities in Canada, we're a bit remote, unfortunately, from people in rural areas and from Indigenous communities, and so it's not necessarily as as a parent. There's a huge opportunity and I think a need in Ontario to do this. And so, any practical tips or suggestions or links and so on. I don't know, Bev, if I'm capturing your question, but I'm interpreting your question for Nadine.
Yeah, it's certainly challenging, and I've been really lucky. At first, I didn't think I was lucky situating myself in a small community and being repeatedly told, being tenure track, that I would be measured against my peers, when all my peers had residents and fellows and lived in Vancouver and they walked down the hallway and they'd be talking to 5 other subspecialists and be brainstorming in between surgical cases. But with my interest in rural, remote, Indigenous health, I every day I saw First Nations patients, Métis patients that had to travel hundreds of kilometers to see me and the challenges they had. And so I was embedded in that area. How to reach out when you're based in Toronto or Vancouver, I think part of it is recognizing that it needs to be a commitment. So at Vancouver, we did start the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. And some of the things that we do, for example, we started a certificate in Indigenous public health. So it's basically a certificate with 8 mandatory courses, and now there's 3 electives that you can take. It's targeted not towards people that are doing their masters or in medical school, or it's targeted to community members. So there's 25 students per class, and it's super hard. I mean, we've had PhD students from the University of Toronto in the class. It's hard to get in if you're a PhD student. It's really hard to get in if you already have your PhD. We've had deans of universities trying to get into the program, and they don't get in, because really part of it is making this available for the community members. And they learn sort of the basics, the introductory level courses of public health, research ethics, data management. And so you can start to have these conversations with them, and they develop the skill set to be part of your research partners. The other thing you could do is, when you're doing research, you can actually look to for job opportunities for people in those communities. They're smart people. They know their communities. They know what's needed. They know what you need to do to run that focus group, or what you need to do to get that data, what you need to do to get access to the medical clinic. They know the physicians that work there. They know there's so many opportunities. And I think the main thing over and over again is to take the standard Western hierarchical up this way and shift it so it's horizontal. And so you have people that are community, people that are academic metropolitan, people that are in the middle. But the more that you can make it equal and recognize that everyone brings something to the circle, I think you're going to be more successful. And Toronto can do that, as long as you keep in mind that you have only one spot in the circle. And an equal spot in the circle would be those people that you engage in those rural, remote, northern First Nation communities.
Yeah, noted. Jim Rutka, a question from our chair.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, and thanks very much, Nadine. You posed some, really powerful questions for us to ponder, and you also gave us a roadmap, which we're really truly appreciative of. You mentioned the name of Mark O'Mara, and he was one of our visiting lecturers not long ago for collaborations that he does with our cancer group here in Toronto. He's a fabulous researcher, as you mentioned, and congratulations on the success that you've had with the Northern Biobanking Initiative. But if you and you've answered to a degree my question, but if you had to kind of break it down into the ingredients for success for non-Indigenous researchers to collaborate with and be successful in research with the Indigenous communities, as, for example, you've done with Marco Mara's work and his group and yours. What would you say? What were the real keys? And I realize the timelines are long and could take time, but what would you say are the real keys to success for these types of partnerships?
I think the main thing is the partnerships being true and honest and transparent. We're at a time in Canada where the patience is low in terms of Indigenous organizations and leaders and community members putting up with the sort of the token involvement and rather than a true partnership. And those take time. They take a long time. I just did a talk on the Northern Biobank Initiative, and Marco was fundamental because he put me in front of that audience at the Terry Fox Research Institute and said, tell them about the problems that you're having and your concerns. And I was absolutely intimidated because of quite honestly, the IQs in that room in the space of genomic research. But I also knew as a surgical oncologist that I was seeing that, one paper here or there at the podium about genomics, and then all of a sudden 25% of the conferences were about genomics, and you couldn't escape that anymore. You were no longer the technician that actually achieved the specimen to be biobanked or to be used. You're actually part of the care team, and that patient's care was going to be directed potentially and ideally with that additional layer. And so I think it took time. So it took 10 years to get where we're at. And I think it really is that list that I showed you. It's recognizing there's a paucity of Indigenous people in this space. And so how do you build that? And part of it is reaching out. So it's not unusual on the research projects that we do that we will post something for a master's student. But if there's no Indigenous master's student, we might end up taking someone that's in second year undergrad. And explain that to granting agencies that say, you said that you were going to use that for a master's person, and now you're hiring a second year undergrad. And our answer is, well, because this second year undergrad, if we give them the opportunity, or we give her the opportunity, they're going to be a master's student one day, and then one day they're going to be applying for your grants if we can do that. So partnership, taking time, recognizing the true collaboration, giving everyone a space at the table, recognizing that everyone brings a part of the expertise. And then I think bringing in more Indigenous scholars, more Indigenous researchers. For example, silent genomes has been amazing. University of Toronto's a key player in the silent genomes. It's interesting though, like we wanted really to have an Indigenous genetic counselor as part of that, because they play such a huge role. There is no Indigenous genetic counselor in Canada that we could find. Like, not that they didn't want to apply or they were already busy. We couldn't find an Indigenous genetic counselor. Yeah. Similarly, and there's no Indigenous medical geneticist, and there's no, and so yeah. there's a lot of firsts yet to come, and there's a lot of onlys, and we really need to change that in that space. And the more welcoming, the more partnerships that are built, it'll happen with time. And I think Canada's moving in the right direction. And University of Toronto, even your land acknowledgement, I think is more robust than ones I've heard in other places. And you're to be congratulated on that for sure.
Yeah, thank you, Nadine. Thanks very much.
Very good. Okay, I'm just looking to see if there are any other questions. I don't see any other questions in the Q&A or in the chat. So I think we'll keep the line open for a few more minutes until 9. If anyone would like to kind of continue to have some informal discussion, but I think what I might do now is kind of bring the rounds to a formal conclusion, but we'll keep the lines open if anyone wants to have a few more minutes for a discussion. And Dr. Caron, it was a spectacular talk, very well received, very appropriate. From a personal perspective, many of your messages really resonated with me very personally, as I indicated when the first time that you and I met over the phone, and why it kind of indicated, why I wanted to kind of reach out to you, because from a personal perspective, my first time that I really experienced Indigenous health, and Jim Rucka will know this, but he and I trained at Queen's for part of our training, and they had a relationship with Moose Factory, and it was really the first time that I had ever really experienced that, and that had a fairly significant impact on me. I think about it, quite a bit. So a lot of really great messages, and on behalf of the Department of Surgery, thank you very much. I really hope that we can get you here in person. We'd like to meet with you. I'd like you to meet with the students, and I'm hoping that this might spark a few practical collaborations as well, because I think that Toronto also has a lot to offer in terms of the expertise and we have some fantastic students and researchers here that I hope that a handful will be inspired to link with you as well. So thank you very much. I'll bring the rounds to a formal close, but we'll keep the line open until for a few more minutes until 9 a.m. then. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Thanks very much, Michael. And Nadine, we do have a few humble gifts that will be coming your way for this wonderful lecture you gave to us, and those will be mailed to you shortly. So again, many thanks. We have a book club in the Department of Surgery, and recently we've been tackling some literatures from Indigenous authors. We've really enjoyed it. It's been fantastic. And one book in particular, I think it's one of the best books I've read of recent, is Split Tooth, which is by Tanya Tagak. And I don't know if you've read it, but it's amazing. And we had a really good discussion about it in our book club. And then the book Seven Fallen Feathers, Tanya Talaga's book, is one that we've been looking at, and among many others. So, I mean, raising awareness, involvement, education, all these things are things that were, I'd say, non-existent 10 years ago, are definitely becoming front and center, even at the University of Toronto. And we have a good faculty of medicine that's leading the way in the charge for, as Michael said at the beginning, making sure that equity, diversity, and inclusion are part and parcel of our way forward at our university. So I don't know if you've read any of those books, or Nadine, if you know those authors, but they were fantastic.
You know what? I haven't heard about Split Tooth, but I'm going to look it up because I am just finishing up a book, so it's perfect timing. But I did read Seven Fallen Feathers. That would be particularly pertinent, based in Ontario. I think that's great. I used to, I don't do it as often anymore. For students that are going to join me in research, I usually give them a book to read, and say, read this book and then give me a shout back and we'll talk about it. And it was kind of my way to sort of see how committed are students. Like, if I'm asking them to put their feet up at the end of the day and read about some, and I would give them Thomas King books or Richard Wagame's books, or and they would be short, but I think they would be relevant. Tanya Talaga's Seven Fallen Feathers was one of the more recent ones. I just think I think they're a great way. Some of them are nonfiction. I think sometimes it's a safer way for students that don't have a lot of exposure for fiction, although most of the fiction is based, unfortunately, on truths. But I love the idea that you have that book club, and I'm going to look up Split Tooth for sure.
Great, thanks.
Have you read the book by Thomas King, The Truth About Stories?
No, I'm going to look that one up, though. Thank you for suggesting
that. I haven't read that either. So Jason from our tech support team has just posted the Amazon link, by the way, for Split Tooth, which actually is
all right.
It is kind of a remarkable a book for sure. Let me just there might be some other questions in Q&A. Let me just have a look here. Oh yes, okay, so here's a question. Dr. Caron, thank you for an amazing talk. Have you ever experienced negative responses or dismissal to the questions you've asked, and how do you navigate this, especially as a trainee?
So the question was, have I ever experienced any negative responses? Oh my goodness. Yeah. And in fact, some of them, one day I want to start a talk with just a bunch of screenshots of emails that come after CBC, like, On the Current or White Coat Black Heart, or, I got a ton after the Peter Mansbridge interview that I did one time, where it's shocking to know that there are people living in our country that would respond, after I say something about the challenges of being Indigenous in the healthcare system, with emails, because you can find them, like they just look you up and your university emails are out there. And it just starts, the email starts off with, "You Indigenous piece of..."
Wow.
And so it's
wow.
And I think the beauty of where Canada is at now is that there is so much, compared to 10 years ago, so much dialogue and openness, people asking this reconciliation, like, what do we do? How do we do it? Are we doing it right? But it does leave those that are, I don't think you can change people's racist attitudes with a single show on TV or a single article, and so I think it must be really hard for them to be exposed to a country that's very different, that was so neutral or turned their back on uncomfortable conversations. I think Canada's doing a much better job now. It must be hard for them. But how to answer the more important question, how do you deal with that as a trainee? I think it's really important to make sure that trainees have a place to talk to about this. And you don't need to be Indigenous to be affected by this. It's just hard to live in a country that you witness that. And but I think the other thing that's really super important is that if you do have Indigenous students anywhere along the spectrum or Indigenous faculty, to recognize that when you hear the statistics, just because they're a rock star medical student or an amazing anesthesiologist or whatever, I think it's really important to recognize that those statistics will most likely apply to them. So it might not be them, but if they have a family, it's most likely going to apply to them, just statistically speaking. And we see that a lot at the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. We hear about missing and murdered women. I have colleagues whose family members are in those statistics. And it seems like something that's just, and these colleagues are just like amazing people that are well established and are secure in their positions in the university and in their scholarship and in their, but it doesn't mean they're immune to it. And so being open and making sure that there's support. I think the Truth and Reconciliation Day this year was unbelievably shocking in terms of how hard it was for Indigenous people in this country. I lost my uncle after the TRC Day. I think that it really rocked the Indigenous communities. Yeah, like it had an impact that I know my mom as a residential school survivor didn't expect. I didn't expect it. My family didn't expect it. And so I think it's really important to make sure that lots of efforts are made to have those supports for particularly Indigenous faculty, staff, and students.
Yeah, definitely. And, it's a big issue, but I think that's, small things also matter. So even trying, I think, is important. So I think that sometimes, because I think, one of the lessons that I've learned from listening to my patients who have, horrific health issues is that small things can matter, and you don't necessarily need to try to cure everything. That, just even trying matters, and I think people appreciate that. And I would think that the fact that we're getting some of the messaging out there is important, just to make people, aware. You have to start somewhere. So I think on that note, we could probably talk all morning. I suspect that you have a day job as well, and I know that a number of people here, there's a fair bit of redeployment going on as well, myself included. We have right now at my hospital about 500 people that are off sick and so on. So a number of us have got to get on with our clinical lives. But I could literally talk with you all morning, but I think we'll have to draw it to a close. Nadine, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and perspectives. I think it really affected a lot of us. I know that a lot of us will be thinking about this for sure, and we'll be reaching out to you. But I think we'll need to draw this to a close. So thank you so much for sharing this with us. A great lecture, and we really enjoyed it very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Take care. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Well.
You as well. You as well. Be well. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.